I am Genesis. I am 31, and the last time my mother commanded a room, she was wearing a $400 silk maternity dress and a silicone prosthetic, asking my stepfather to sign away his estate. I stood at a podium with a heavy binder. 100 country club guests stared at me. I leaned into the microphone to tell them exactly where the money went. The room went so silent you could hear the air conditioning hum. But the trap I sprung that night started 8 weeks earlier in a room that was supposed to be mine. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance, where quiet women set firm boundaries and the truth always clears the ledger. If a family member ever hijacked your joy to fund their own illusions, you will feel this one. Drop a comment, tell me how old you are, and hit subscribe so you do not miss the ending. I am a data privacy auditor for a healthcare logistics firm in Providence, Rhode Island. My entire career is built on sitting in quiet rooms, staring at numbers, and identifying anomalies. When the data does not align with the narrative, I do not panic. I observe. I have spent my life observing my mother, Valerie. She does not live in reality. She lives in an economy of attention, and she was running a deficit. It was mid-October in Newport. The salt air coming off the Atlantic mixed with the scent of catered crab cakes and expensive floral arrangements. It was my baby shower. I was 7 months pregnant, sitting on a velvet chair, while 30 of my friends and relatives handed me pastel gift bags. My husband Liam stood by the French doors, nursing a sparkling water and tracking the catering schedule. The afternoon was orderly. It was peaceful. Then Valerie tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The jazz music playing from the corner speakers seemed to dip. Valerie stepped to the center of the room. She was 52 years old, dressed in a tailored ivory pantsuit. She did not look at me. She looked at the audience. She placed a manicured hand flat against her stomach. "Genesis has brought us together for such a beautiful reason," she said. Her voice carried the practiced cadence of a stage actor. "And the universe is working in harmony. David and I are expecting a miracle of our own." The silence in the room shifted from polite attention to stunned disbelief. I did not drop my glass. I did not storm out of the venue. I watched David. My stepfather stood 3 feet behind Valerie. He did not step forward to hold her waist. His jaw was rigid. He stared at the floorboards instead of fielding the sudden applause. He looked pale, almost sick. A distinct noise cut through the chatter. Cha-ching! It was a loud, digitized cash register sound. It came from David's jacket pocket. That was the custom notification tone he used for his contracting business, signaling a withdrawal from his primary accounts. He flinched, reached into his coat, and silenced the device. His eyes darted toward the exit. Valerie ignored him. She was busy collecting the awe of 30 women. "It is so warm in here," she murmured. She hooked a thumb under the waistband of her tailored trousers. She scratched at the fabric. She tugged the material away from her skin, wincing slightly, as if the garment was causing a rash. I noted the friction. Silk does not chafe. Something underneath the silk was bothering her. "We even have the first picture," she announced. Reaching into her designer clutch, she produced a square of paper. She handed it to the woman nearest her. The photograph began a slow rotation around the room, followed by coos and breathless questions. When it finally reached my hands, I ran my thumb over the surface. It was an ultrasound printout, but the texture was wrong. It felt thick and slick. It felt like glossy printer photo paper, not the thin, heat-sensitive thermal film used in actual medical clinics. I stared at the black and white smear of static. Valerie caught my eye from across the gift table. She offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was a dare disguised as maternal joy. She expected a scene. She wanted a weeping hormonal daughter to secure her position as the patient, victimized mother. I handed the photo back to the nearest guest, picked up my water, and took a slow sip. The audit had begun. The catering staff moved through the Newport venue like shadows, gathering discarded dessert plates and folding linen napkins. The party was winding down, but the air remained thick with the aftermath of my mother's performance. Guests lingered near the coat check, whispering in small clusters. Their eyes kept darting toward Valerie. She sat on the edge of a velvet settee, sipping sparkling water, resting a hand on her stomach. She looked like a martyr, enduring the exhaustion of a sacred duty. Liam was by the front entrance, tipping the valet and loading the last of the pastel gift bags into our car. His presence was a steady anchor in a room that suddenly felt tilted off its axis. He caught my eye from across the foyer and offered a silent, questioning nod. I gave him a slight tilt of my chin. Not yet. Wait. I stood alone by the gift table, sorting through a stack of congratulatory cards. The glossy ultrasound photo burned a hole in my blazer pocket. I was running a mental inventory of the afternoon, cataloging David's pale face, the digital cash register chime from his phone, and the strange friction of Valerie scratching her waistband. Genesis. The voice was low, barely a scrape above the jazz music still piping through the speakers. I turned. Aunt Helen stood near a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas. She was my mother's older sister, though they looked nothing alike. Valerie spent her days chasing youth with expensive serums and tailored silk. Helen wore dark slacks, practical leather loafers, and carried a quiet, unbothered authority. She had not spoken to Valerie in 10 years. They had a falling out over a financial dispute regarding their late father's estate. Helen only attended this shower for me. She stepped closer, ensuring the floral arrangement shielded us from Valerie's line of sight. Helen did not offer a hug. She did not offer a sympathetic smile. She smelled faintly of clove and cold autumn air. "Your mother is putting on quite a show," Helen murmured, her eyes tracking Valerie across the room. "She always does," I replied, keeping my tone level. Helen turned her attention back to me. Her gaze was sharp, analytical. We shared the same pragmatism. She reached out and briefly touched my wrist. It was a grounding gesture. "You are a smart girl, Genesis. You look at numbers for a living. You find the things people try to bury." I waited. Helen was not a woman who wasted words. "Do not ask her about this baby," Helen said. Her voice dropped another octave, forcing me to lean in. "Ask her what really happened during her spa retreat in Cabo." My brow furrowed. Cabo, 2014. I was 19 years old. Valerie had announced she was suffering from severe emotional exhaustion. She booked a 3-week holistic healing retreat in Mexico, funded entirely by my former stepfather, a man she divorced 2 years later. When she returned from that trip, she was pale, gaunt, and moved with a careful stiffness she blamed on a deep tissue detox. "What about Cabo, Helen?" I asked. Helen adjusted the strap of her purse. "I am not going to hand you the answer. You need to see it for yourself to understand what you are dealing with. Look at the medical transport records. Look at the dates." Before I could press her further, Helen turned and walked toward the exit. She did not say goodbye to Valerie. She simply vanished into the crisp October afternoon, leaving me standing by the gift table with a new coordinate on my map. Cabo, 2014. Records. I traced the edge of the glossy ultrasound paper in my pocket. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. Instead, a familiar, cold clarity settled over my mind. It was the exact same sensation I experienced on my 18th birthday. The memory surfaced uninvited, but sharply relevant. I was sitting in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office at a used car dealership in Warwick. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. I had saved $3,000 from working double shifts at a local bakery. I was there to buy a 10-year-old Honda Civic. It was my ticket to independence. The finance manager, a tired-looking man with a mustard-yellow short-sleeved shirt, sat across the metal desk. He was staring at his computer monitor. He hit a key, and a dot matrix printer groaned to life in the corner. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was covered in red ink. "I am sorry, Genesis," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I cannot approve this loan. Your debt-to-income ratio is entirely upside down. You have 5 accounts in collections." I stared at the paper. I did not own a credit card. I only carried a debit card tied to my bakery earnings. But there it was, printed in stark black and red. 5 premium retail accounts, a high-end department store, a luxury cosmetics brand, a boutique furniture outlet. The balances totaled over $14,000. The accounts had been opened the exact month I turned 18, utilizing my Social Security number. I drove home that day in silence, taking the bus back to the house I shared with Valerie. I found her in the kitchen, unboxing a new espresso machine. I set the credit report on the granite island. Valerie looked at the paper, then looked at me. She did not apologize. She did not offer a rational explanation. Her eyes welled with tears on command. She orchestrated a brilliant weeping defense. She claimed she needed the funds to maintain our household image, to keep up appearances, so she could secure a better job. She told me family required sacrifice. She treated my identity like a slush fund, and when caught, she cast herself as the victim of economic hardship. That betrayal defined the rest of my life. I spent the next 5 years aggressively repairing my credit score, disputing fraudulent charges, and learning the intricate mechanics of financial systems. I realized that people will craft elaborate emotional narratives to justify their theft. People will lie to your face while crying tears of fabricated pain. But numbers do not weep. Ledgers do not lie. Data leaves a trail. That realization birthed my career. I became a data privacy auditor because I vowed to never let a performance blind me to a deficit again. Now, standing in the Newport Ballroom 13 years later, the same predator was running a new scheme. The target had simply changed. She was no longer draining an 18-year-old bakery worker. She was targeting a 55-year-old contractor with a multi-million-dollar estate. Liam approached the gift table. He touched the small of my back. "The car is packed," he said quietly. "Are you ready to go home?" I looked across the room one last time. Valerie was helping David into his coat. He still looked physically ill. The digital cash register chime echoed in my memory. The glossy paper burned in my pocket. The ghost of Cabo hovered in the air. "Yes," I told Liam, "I am ready." We walked out to the SUV. I did not speak during the 40-minute drive back to Providence. I watched the autumn trees blur past the passenger window, organizing the puzzle pieces in my mind. Valerie had presented a fake ultrasound. David was bleeding cash. Helen had pointed to a medical trip from a decade ago. When we reached our townhouse, Liam carried the gifts into the nursery. I walked straight to my home office. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the glow of the dual monitors illuminating the dark room. I placed the glossy ultrasound photo flat on my desk. I opened a secure browser window. I typed the words Cabo Medical Transport Records into the search bar. My mother wanted to play a game of high-stakes illusions. She wanted to steal my joy to fund her theater. She thought I would stay quiet out of familial obligation. She underestimated the auditor. The hunt had officially begun. I sat in the glow of my dual monitors. The quiet of my Providence townhouse felt like a sanctuary after the noise of Newport. I placed the sonogram flat against the mahogany surface of my desk. To my mother, this square of paper was a theater prop. It was a golden ticket to sympathy, a shield against criticism, and a magnet for attention. She wielded it to command a room, forcing everyone to adjust their gravity to her orbit. But to an auditor, paper is never just a prop. It is a substrate. It is a physical receipt that carries data, and data operates by a strict set of rules. Real sonograms are printed on thermal film. I know this because I have a stack of my own sitting in a manila folder 2 rooms down the hall. Thermal film is flimsy. It is heat sensitive. It curls at the edges and feels thin between your fingertips. It holds a distinct, almost metallic scent. If you leave it in a hot car, the image turns black. The ink does not sit on top of the page. It is burned into the material. I pressed my thumb against the surface of Valerie's picture. It did not yield. The stock was heavy, rigid, and coated in a high-gloss finish. It caught the blue light of my monitors, reflecting it back in a solid glare. This was standard premium photo paper. It was the kind you buy in bulk at an office supply store and run through an inkjet printer. It was a fabrication printed in a home office. I picked up my phone, turned on the overhead desk lamp, and snapped a high-resolution picture of the printout. I transferred the file to my workstation and dragged the image into a reverse search engine. The progress bar crawled across the screen. I listened to the faint hum of the central heating kicking on. My profession requires patience. You never jump to conclusions. You wait for the system to process the inputs. You let the algorithm sort through billions of indexed images to find the anomaly. The screen populated with dozens of identical thumbnails. I clicked the top result. The page redirected to a medical wellness blog based in Munich. The article was dated November 12, 2019. The post discussed prenatal nutrition during the second trimester. Featured at the top of the article was the exact same sonogram. Every shadow, every pixelated curve of the fetal spine, the precise pattern of static framing the womb, matched perfectly. It was an identical copy. I zoomed in on the top margin of the image I had photographed. Valerie had cropped the picture just below the original watermark, but she lacked the technical skill to remove the date string cleanly. The edge showed a faint cutoff line of text. The date format read day, month, year. Rhode Island clinics use month, day, year. Furthermore, the patient identification prefix lacked the standard alphanumeric sequence required by any regional healthcare network in New England. This was not a hysterical delusion. My mother had not convinced herself she was carrying a child through some psychosomatic breakdown. She had deliberately searched for a stock image, downloaded it, cropped it, and printed it on glossy paper to display at my baby shower. She was executing a calculated, premeditated fraud. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The air in my office suddenly felt stifling. I walked down the hallway, letting the soft glow of the recessed lighting guide me. The scent of fresh, low-volatile organic compound paint drifted from the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. I stood in the doorway. Liam was balanced on a small aluminum step stool. He was carefully running a roller loaded with sage green paint along the upper trim of the wall. He wore a faded college shirt speckled with white primer. His movements were steady, methodical, and calm. He was building a real room for a real child. There was no audience. There was no applause. There was only the quiet, authentic work of preparing for a life we created together. Looking at my husband, the contrast between our reality and my mother's manufactured illusion sharpened into a painful point. Valerie spent her entire existence constructing hollow facades, demanding everyone else pay the admission fee to watch her perform. I had spent 13 years building a life that was solid, verifiable, and true. I refused to let her bring her theater into my home. But the real victim was not me. I had survived Valerie. I knew her playbook. I knew how to build a firewall around my emotions. The true target was my stepfather. David was a good man. He built a successful contracting business from nothing, working grueling hours, laying foundations, pouring concrete, and managing crews. He paid for my college textbooks when Valerie claimed we did not have the budget, despite her closet full of designer shoes. He was a stable, quiet force in my turbulent youth. He was wealthy, but he was naive. He possessed a fundamental decency that made him vulnerable to predators. He believed people told the truth because he told the truth. David had always wanted a child of his own. He married Valerie, assuming they would build a family. Valerie knew this. She had weaponized his deepest, most vulnerable desire against him. I thought about his pale face at the party. I remembered his eyes darting toward the floorboards. I recalled the digital cash register chime signaling money leaving his accounts. Valerie was not just seeking attention. She was siphoning his assets. If I confronted her now with just a stock photo, she would spin a lie. She would claim she lost the real photo and printed a placeholder because she wanted to share the joy. She would cry. She would call me a jealous, bitter daughter who could not stand sharing the spotlight. David would defend her because he desperately wanted the baby to be real. I could not blow up the party with a single piece of circumstantial evidence. I needed an ironclad ledger. I needed a paper trail so undeniable that no amount of tears could wash it away. I walked back to my office and sat down at my desk. I opened a new encrypted spreadsheet. I labeled the first column Date, the second column Event, and the third column Financial Discrepancy. I logged the Munich sonogram. I noted the high-gloss paper. I reached for my notebook to write down the name of the Boston doctor David had mentioned in passing earlier in the month, a telehealth specialist named Dr. Aris. I needed to verify his medical license. Before my fingers touched the keyboard, my email inbox chimed. A forwarded message from David had just landed in my personal account. The subject line read, High Risk Miracle Pregnancy Fund. I clicked open the message, and the true scope of my mother's theft finally revealed itself on my screen. I opened the forwarded email from my stepfather. It contained a single link to a popular crowdfunding platform. The campaign banner featured a soft-focus, sepia-toned photograph of Valerie and David looking wistfully at a sunset. The campaign title read, High Risk Miracle Pregnancy Fund. The text below it was a masterclass in emotional extortion. Valerie detailed a grueling, perilous path forward. She claimed she required highly experimental, out-of-pocket telehealth treatments to ensure the baby survived the second trimester. She wrote about her fragile state, her sleepless nights, and her unwavering faith. She set the financial goal at $50,000. I looked at the progress bar. In less than 48 hours, the fund had accumulated $14,000. The donor list was a roster of David's country club associates, his suppliers, and his extended family. She was draining his social capital while simultaneously harvesting their wallets. I closed the browser tab. The money was a symptom. The Boston specialist she referenced in the campaign was the actual disease. David had mentioned the physician's name during a tense phone call 2 weeks prior, Dr. Aris. He handled Valerie's care exclusively via video calls. According to my mother, the hour-long commute up Interstate 95 was far too strenuous for her delicate condition. I opened a new window and navigated to the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine public portal. My fingers moved over the mechanical keyboard with practiced rhythm. I typed the last name. 6 results populated the screen. I filtered the results by the obstetrics and gynecology specialty. 1 profile remained. The first name matched, the specialty matched, but the status indicator next to his profile glowed in bold red text. Revoked. I clicked the attached disciplinary action document. It was a 40-page file detailing a sprawling investigation. On March 12, 2021, the medical board permanently stripped his license for severe prescription fraud. He had been operating a shadow clinic in South Boston, writing thousands of illegal narcotics prescriptions for cash. He was not a practicing physician. He was a disgraced civilian facing a mountain of legal restrictions. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, tracing the architecture of my mother's scam. It was terrifyingly smart. A doctor with a revoked medical license cannot legally bill private health care insurance. Without insurance billing, there is no explanation of benefits mailed to the house. There are no copay receipts generated. There is 0 paper trail for David to intercept in the Daily Mail. Valerie could lock herself in the master bedroom, claim she was logging into a secure telehealth portal, and emerge an hour later demanding cash for out-of-pocket consultation fees. Dr. Aris was a financial ghost. I needed physical evidence linking her to this ghost. I needed to see the device she used to communicate with him. The following afternoon, I drove out to their sprawling colonial home in East Greenwich. I brought a stack of unwritten thank you notes from the baby shower, providing the perfect mundane cover story for an unannounced visit. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp pine needles. David was in the front yard, kneeling in the dirt, wrestling with a cracked PVC irrigation pipe. He wore stained canvas work pants and a faded flannel shirt. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped under a weight that had nothing to do with landscaping or physical labor. "Genesis," he said, wiping mud from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Valerie is inside. She is resting." "She rests a lot these days," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "The specialist insists on strict bed rest," David said. He stared down at the broken pipe instead of looking me in the eye. "He monitors her vitals every single morning." Does he monitor them through a computer screen, David? I asked.
My stepfather shifted his weight, his work boots sinking into the wet grass. She buys the blood pressure cuffs at the pharmacy. She reads him the numbers over the camera. It is unconventional, I know, but he is the best in his field. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. The alternative was too devastating for his mind to process. I left David to his broken pipes and walked through the heavy mahogany front door. The house was silent, save for the faint, steady sound of running water echoing from the master suite upstairs. Valerie was drawing a bath. The kitchen was pristine. White marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, and zero signs of human warmth. Sitting in the center of the kitchen island, next to a bowl of polished, artificial fruit, was Valerie's tablet. The screen was dark. I stepped up to the marble island, keeping my ears tuned to the sound of the water upstairs. I tapped the glass. The screen woke up, demanding a passcode. I knew her code. It was her own birth year. I punched in the 4 digits. The device unlocked instantly, opening directly to her default email inbox. I expected to find fake invoice templates. I expected to find encrypted correspondence with the disgraced doctor, or perhaps shipping receipts for the silicone prosthetic she wore beneath her silk trousers. My fingers moved swiftly, swiping past promotional retail emails and country club newsletters. Then, a bold subject line caught my eye. It did not contain the word doctor, ultrasound, or billing. The subject line read, Expedited Infant Placement Inquiry. The sender was an encrypted address ending in a domain based in Eastern Europe. I tapped the message, my breath catching in my throat. The email was a direct reply to a query Valerie had sent 3 days prior. The text was clinical, detached, and chilling. Regarding your interest in an expedited international placement, the message read, Our agency specializes in discreet, undocumented transfers. Given your requested timeline of a spring delivery, we require an initial non-refundable wire transfer of $30,000 to secure the birth mother and bypass standard regulatory holding periods. My chest tightened. A cold sweat broke across my palms. My pulse hammered against my ribs. This was no longer just a financial grift. This was not a simple matter of draining a bank account to pay off hidden debts. Valerie was actively inquiring about purchasing a human child through an unregulated offshore broker. She was trying to procure an actual baby to present to David when the fake pregnancy reached its 9-month conclusion. The stakes mutated in a fraction of a second. Wire fraud is a white-collar crime. International child trafficking crosses a moral boundary I had never prepared to navigate. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind racing through the terrifying implications. Will she actually do this? Could she wire $30,000 of David's money to a shadow agency in a foreign country and return to Rhode Island with a stolen infant? The logistics were insane, yet the email stared back at me, a digital testament to her boundless desperation. I quickly forwarded the email to my secure Proton account. I immediately deleted the forwarded message from her sent folder, leaving no trace of my intrusion. I locked the tablet and pushed it exactly 2 inches from the fruit bowl, replacing it right where I found it. The plumbing groaned loudly as the bathwater shut off upstairs. Valerie would be coming down soon. I walked out the back door, slipping past David in the yard without another word. My mind reeled. The hunt had escalated from an audit into a race against a biological clock of my mother's own making. The forwarded email sat encrypted on my secure server, radiating a terrifying gravity. The potential for international human trafficking hung heavy over every interaction I had with my mother following that afternoon in East Greenwich. I spent my evenings combing through foreign domain registries, attempting to trace the offshore agency. My days were consumed by the meticulous, quiet work of data privacy auditing for my firm, while my nights were devoted to auditing the woman who raised me. But Valerie was not a static target. She was a master of psychological warfare. If I was quietly gathering ammunition, she was loudly launching mortar shells into my daily life. She understood that power in our family dynamic was a zero-sum game.
To secure her position as the beloved, fragile matriarch, she needed to diminish my impending motherhood.
The attack arrived on a Thursday evening. Liam and I were hosting a small, informal dinner at our Providence townhouse. David and Valerie were the only guests. I had spent the afternoon slow roasting a leg of lamb, chopping root vegetables, and attempting to curate a peaceful environment. Liam was setting the dining table, carefully placing the silverware on the linen placemats. He caught my eye across the kitchen island, offering a silent nod of solidarity. He knew the stakes. He knew about the email. We were navigating a minefield, disguised as a family dinner. The doorbell chimed right at 6. I opened the door to find David holding a bottle of sparkling cider and a bouquet of seasonal flowers. He looked weary, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than they had been a week prior. Valerie swept past him into the foyer. She wore a flowing empire waist dress that emphasized the rounded mound of her midsection. She moved with deliberate, exaggerated care, placing a hand on the small of her back as she crossed the threshold. "Genesis, darling." She sighed, leaning in for an air kiss that left the heavy scent of gardenia perfume lingering in my hallway. "You look so tired. Are you getting enough iron? You really must be careful at your age." "I am 31, I replied, hanging David's coat in the closet. "I am fine." We moved to the dining room. The conversation was strained, consisting of safe, hollow topics like the weather, the upcoming holiday traffic, and Liam's latest architectural project. Valerie dominated the space, detailing the imaginary exhaustion of her high-risk second trimester. I watched her cut her lamb into tiny, meticulous pieces, performing the role of a delicate patient, unable to digest heavy food. Halfway through the meal, a heavy knock echoed from the front door. Liam frowned, wiping his mouth with a napkin. I am not expecting a delivery. He pushed back his chair and walked down the hall. A moment later, he returned. A delivery driver stood behind him in the foyer, holding a clipboard and looking impatient. "Mrs. Valerie," the driver called out, "I have a freight delivery requiring a signature." Valerie dabbed her lips with her napkin, feigning surprise. Oh, my goodness. They were not supposed to deliver this until tomorrow. "David, sweetheart, go sign the paperwork. Have them bring the crates into the front room." David looked confused, but complied. The driver and an assistant hauled 3 massive wooden crates into my small foyer, stacking them against the wall. The crates were stamped with the logo of a high-end bespoke furniture atelier based in Milan. The invoice taped to the side of the top box read $5,200. I looked at the invoice. Then I looked at Valerie. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a triumphant glint. "What is this?" I asked, my voice flat. "It is the nursery centerpiece," Valerie said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I saw the old scratched heirloom crib you and Liam restored. It is quaint, Genesis. It really is. It has a rustic charm. But this miracle deserves something flawless. I contacted a master carpenter in Italy. He recreated the exact design of your heirloom crib, but he utilized imported, sustainably sourced mahogany." She paused, letting the price tag hang in the air. "It is a replica," she continued softly, "but it is better. It is perfect. I wanted you to see it before we took it home to the estate." My chest tightened. The audacity was breathtaking. She had not simply purchased a luxury item. She had weaponized David's credit card to custom order an exact copy of the crib my own grandmother had slept in, solely to prove that her imaginary baby possessed a higher market value than my real one. She shipped it to my house during dinner to maximize the humiliation. It was a power move, designed to break my composure and force me into an ugly public tantrum. I looked at David. He stood by the wooden crates holding the delivery clipboard. He did not look proud. He looked sick to his stomach. I turned back to the table. I picked up my fork. "The mahogany is a beautiful choice," I said. "It will look striking against a white wall." Valerie's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She expected a fight. She wanted a screaming match over family heirlooms and financial extravagance. My quiet acceptance derailed her script. She reached for her crystal goblet, taking a long, deliberate sip of the amber liquid inside.
"This cider is surprisingly crisp," she murmured. I sat close enough to smell her perfume. As she lowered the glass, a different scent drifted across the table. It was sharp, yeasty, and distinctly alcoholic. It was the undeniable tang of expensive, dry champagne. She was drinking real champagne while wearing a silicone belly, celebrating a $5,000 crib purchased for a child that did not exist. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Before I could comment, a sharp noise cut through the dining room. Cha-ching! The digital cash register chime rang out from David's coat pocket hanging in the hallway closet. It was loud, abrupt, and impossible to ignore. David froze by the crates. His face flushed a deep crimson. He did not move to retrieve the phone. He simply stood there, staring at the wooden boxes his money had just purchased. Valerie smiled, but the edges of her mouth trembled. Her eyes darted toward the hallway. They were frantic. The smug satisfaction of the custom crib vanished, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. The chime meant money was moving. It meant an account was draining. She is flaunting wealth to humiliate me, I realized while secretly bleeding him dry behind the scenes. The offshore adoption agency email flashed in my mind. $30,000. Was that the chime? Did she just execute the wire transfer from the dinner table? The urge to stand up, rip the silicone off her waist, and scream the truth at David was overwhelming. It burned in my throat. But I am an auditor. The cardinal rule of my profession is absolute restraint. You never reveal the audit until the ledger is complete. If I attacked her now, she would claim the champagne was a mistake. She would claim the crib was a generous impulse. She would paint me as an ungrateful host. I picked up the bottle of sparkling cider resting on the table. I poured a measure into my own glass. "Let me pour you another glass, Valerie," I said, my voice steady and cool. "We should toast to the new delivery." Valerie clutched her crystal goblet, pulling it close to her chest. "No, thank you," she whispered. Her gaze remained locked on the hallway closet, waiting for the digital chime to ring again. The silence that followed was heavier than the wooden crates sitting in my foyer. The conflict had mutated. Valerie was no longer just running a scam. She was running out of time. The heavy wooden crates holding the bespoke replica crib sat in my foyer for 2 days before Liam rented a box truck and drove them back to David's estate in East Greenwich. I refused to let the physical manifestation of my mother's spite occupy my home. When Liam returned, he brought a quiet, grim energy back into the townhouse. He hung up his jacket, walked into my home office, and sat on the edge of the leather armchair. "David is a ghost," Liam said, his voice flat. He was sitting in his home office when I dropped off the crates. He looked right through me. Valerie was upstairs claiming she was on a telehealth call with Dr. Aris. She refused to come down. David signed the delivery receipt and handed it back without a word. "He is drowning, Genesis. We cannot just watch him sink." I stared at the dual monitors glowing in front of me. Liam was right. The digital cash register chime from the dinner party still echoed in my ears. The $30,000 offshore agency email remained encrypted on my server. Valerie was executing a financial demolition under the guise of maternal fragility. I had gathered circumstantial evidence. I had uncovered a disgraced Boston physician. I had found a fake ultrasound printed on glossy office paper. I had smelled real champagne masking as sparkling cider. But none of that was a kill shot. None of that was an undeniable ledger entry that would shatter the illusion for a man desperate to believe he was finally becoming a father. A skilled narcissist can spin circumstantial evidence into a narrative of persecution. If I presented David with the forged sonogram, Valerie would cry and say she was simply too stressed to find the original. If I brought up the revoked medical license, she would claim she was a victim of medical malpractice and did not know his credentials were compromised. I needed the biological truth. I needed the coordinate Aunt Helen had handed me by the gift table at the baby shower. Cabo, 2014. I turned back to my keyboard. The medical privacy laws in the United States, specifically the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, create an ironclad fortress around patient records. As a data privacy auditor, I understand those firewalls better than most. I cannot legally access a hospital database to pull a surgical chart. However, civil transport records, insurance subrogation claims filed in public courts, and international medical evacuation logs operate in a slightly different jurisdiction. When a private citizen requires emergency international extraction, the billing disputes often spill into the public civil dockets. I logged into a specialized subscription-based legal database that aggregates county and federal civil filings. I entered Valerie's full legal name, including her maiden name and the surname of her previous husband. I set the date parameter to the summer of 2014. I filtered the jurisdiction to include the state of Texas, specifically the border counties handling medical transport logistics from Mexico. The search algorithm chewed through the data for 3 agonizing minutes. I listened to the steady rhythm of Liam's breathing from the armchair behind me. Then the screen populated a single result. It was a civil subrogation claim filed in October of 2014. A private medical evacuation company based in Houston was suing Valerie's former insurance provider over a denied payment for an emergency cross-border airlift. The document was 42 pages long, mostly consisting of dense legal arguments regarding international billing codes. But on page 17, buried in the summary of facts, the legal counsel detailed the medical necessity of the transport to justify the exorbitant flight cost. I highlighted the text. My eyes tracked across the glowing screen, reading the clinical, detached language. Patient suffered a catastrophic ectopic rupture while vacationing in Cabo San Lucas. Due to severe internal hemorrhaging and lack of specialized surgical facilities in the immediate resort area, patient was airlifted to a trauma center in Texas. Upon arrival, emergency surgical intervention was required to stabilize the patient. The procedure performed was an emergency bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy and partial hysterectomy. I stopped breathing. The air in my home office suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. I read the sentence again. Emergency partial hysterectomy. The implications crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. Aunt Helen was right. The exhaustion, the pale complexion, the stiff movements Valerie blamed on a deep tissue detox retreat were the lingering effects of major abdominal surgery. My mother had not possessed a uterus in 10 years. Pregnancy was not just unlikely given her age. It was not just high risk. It was a biological impossibility. The entire foundation of her performance, the tears, the fake sonogram, the bespoke replica crib, the high-risk miracle pregnancy fund that had already collected $14,000, was built on a vacuum. There was no baby. There could never be a baby. The itchiness she experienced at the baby shower, the constant scratching at the waistband of her tailored trousers, suddenly made perfect sense. It was not sensitive skin. It was not menopause. She was wearing a silicone prosthetic strapped to her waist. The synthetic material was chafing against her skin under the heat of the ballroom lights. A cold, terrifying irony settled over me. From this precise minute forward, I possessed the nuclear code. I knew the biological truth, but David did not. The country club guests writing checks to the crowdfunding campaign did not. The family members sending congratulatory floral arrangements did not. They were all participating in a grand emotional theater, completely unaware that the lead actress was missing the basic anatomy required for the role. Liam leaned forward in the armchair. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp. He recognized the shift in my posture. I turned the monitor toward him. I did not speak. I simply pointed to the highlighted text on page 17. Liam read the legal summary. His eyes widened. He sat back slowly, the leather chair creaking under his weight. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of profound shock and deep, visceral disgust. "She has no uterus," Liam whispered, stating the impossible fact aloud. "She is physically incapable of carrying a child. Genesis, the offshore adoption email, the $30,000. She is not going to adopt a baby to raise. She is trying to buy a stolen infant to present to David so she does not get caught faking a pregnancy she physically cannot have." The pieces locked together, with a sickening click. The scam was not just a grift for attention. It was a desperate, escalating crime designed to cement her financial hold over a multi-million-dollar estate. She had trapped herself in a lie so massive, the only way out was to purchase a human being on the black market. The suspense in the room shifted entirely. The question was no longer if Valerie was lying. The ledger was complete. The biological truth was undeniable. The question was no longer if she was a predator. The only question left was when and how I was going to detonate this bomb. If I sent the legal document to David quietly, Valerie would intercept the email. She controlled his digital life. If I confronted her privately, she would find a way to manipulate the narrative, perhaps claiming a miraculous, undocumented IVF procedure involving a surrogate she kept hidden. She would spin a web of lies so thick, David would become lost in the confusion. I could not allow her to control the venue. I needed an audience. I needed a public arena where her performance would be dismantled, fact by fact, receipt by receipt, in front of the very people she was attempting to defraud. I needed a stage where the silicone belly could not be hidden behind silk trousers and fake tears. My phone vibrated on the desk, shattering the heavy silence in the office. The caller ID displayed my stepfather's name. I picked up the device, taking a deep breath to steady my pulse. The auditor's code remained. Never reveal the ledger until the final audit presentation. "Hello, David," I said, my voice smooth and controlled. "Genesis," he sounded breathless, his words tumbling over each other. "Valerie just finalized the invitations. She wants to do something big. She says the stress of the high-risk treatments has been too much, and she wants to celebrate the milestone. We are hosting a gender reveal gala at the country club next month. 100 guests. I need you to be there. Please, it would mean the world to her. A public gala, 100 guests. The perfect venue had just presented itself." "I will be there, David," I promised. Looking at the highlighted text on my monitor, I would not miss it for the world. I hung up the phone with David. The glow of the dual monitors illuminated the dark walls of my home office. A gender reveal gala. 100 guests. My stepfather was inviting his entire social and professional network to celebrate a biological impossibility. I placed my phone face down on the mahogany desk. The stage was set, but I needed to understand the final act of my mother's script before the curtain went up. I opened a new browser tab and navigated back to the crowdfunding platform. The campaign page loaded, displaying the sepia-toned photograph of Valerie and David. The progress bar beneath the image had surged forward. The total now sat at $22,000. The donor feed was a scrolling ledger of my stepfather's good reputation. Local hardware suppliers, country club members, and distant relatives had all contributed. They were writing checks to support a high-risk medical journey that did not exist. Crowdfunding platforms require a verified routing number to disperse collected capital. I needed to know where that money was resting. Years ago, before the credit card fraud incident that severed our trust, Valerie had forced me to set up her online banking portals. She claimed she was technologically illiterate. I had created the administrative recovery keys and never deleted them from my encrypted password manager. I initiated a remote login. The system prompted a two-factor authentication challenge, which bypassed her phone and routed to the backup email address I controlled. I was in. I bypassed her checking and savings ledgers and went straight to the linked external accounts. The crowdfunding payouts were not funneling into the joint marital accounts she shared with David. They were routing into a separate, high-yield private trust she had opened in her maiden name just 3 weeks prior. The capital was being isolated. She was building an independent war chest. But the offshore adoption agency email still haunted my thoughts. I needed to know if she had actually wired $30,000 to purchase a stolen infant from an unregulated overseas broker. If she brought a trafficked child across international borders, the situation would escalate from wire fraud to a federal felony, carrying mandatory prison time. Using the same administrative access, I pulled a remote backup of her cloud-synchronized devices. I downloaded her mobile browsing history and filtered the data by chronological timestamps, starting from the afternoon I found the encrypted email on her kitchen tablet. I scrolled through lines of digital footprint data. I searched for domain registries based in Eastern Europe. I looked for encrypted communication portals. There was nothing. The search strings regarding international adoption abruptly stopped a day after she sent the initial inquiry. The red herring dissolved on my screen. Valerie had abandoned the trafficking idea. Sitting in the quiet of my office, the reasoning became chillingly clear. Procurement of a living human child is a logistical nightmare. A living infant requires a forged birth certificate, pediatric visits, Social Security registration, and a physical footprint that federal authorities can track. A living child is an endless liability to a woman who only cares about herself. Valerie did not want the burden of raising a baby. She only wanted the leverage a baby provided. I kept scrolling down the chronological list of her search queries. As the dates moved closer to the present, the search terms mutated. The words on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. Symptoms of spontaneous placental abruption. How to fake a third trimester medical emergency. Inducing a chemical miscarriage at home. Grieving a late-term loss fund. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The wheels scraped against the hardwood floor. The sheer staggering cruelty of her endgame laid itself bare across my monitors. Valerie never intended to produce a child. She never intended to fake a birth. The gala was not a celebration of life. It was the peak of a calculated narrative arc before a staged, tragic fall. Her plan was methodical. She would host the gender reveal gala. She would bask in the attention of 100 guests. She would collect the cash envelopes, the expensive gifts, and the crowdfunding payouts. Then, a few weeks later, she would orchestrate a medical crisis. She would lock herself in a bathroom, stage a hemorrhage, and claim the disgraced Boston telehealth doctor could not save the miracle. She would transition seamlessly from a high-risk, brave mother into a devastated, grieving victim. The crowdfunding page would pivot from a pregnancy fund to a bereavement fund. The country club guests would send more money. The suppliers would send more flowers. And David would be broken. My stepfather was currently spending his evenings assembling nursery furniture and painting walls. He was choosing names. He was rearranging his life to welcome a child he had always wanted. Valerie was planning to force him into a hospital waiting room to mourn a ghost. She would bind him to her forever through a fabricated trauma, ensuring he would never leave a grieving woman. He would spend the rest of his life tending to a shrine built on a lie. The emotional cost of the truth settled heavily onto my shoulders. Exposing my mother meant executing a brutal rescue mission. If I dropped the ledger on Valerie at the gala, I would humiliate her, but I would also publicly shatter David's heart. I would be the one to tell him the baby he loved was nothing more than a silicone prop and a stock photo from Munich. I would destroy his joy. But if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in a psychological torture. I would allow Valerie to poison his mind with a fake tragedy. I had to choose between a sharp, sudden blade of truth or the slow, agonizing poison of a manufactured mourning. I looked at the sage green paint drying in my own nursery down the hall. I touched my own stomach. I thought about the kind of mother I wanted to be. An auditor does not hide the deficit to spare the client's feelings. An auditor delivers the facts so the client can survive the bankruptcy. I pulled a fresh, blank binder from my supply cabinet. It was thick, heavy, and bound in black leather. I began printing the documents. The revoked medical license, the high-gloss sonogram comparison, the subrogation claim from the Texas Trauma Center detailing her hysterectomy, the browser history displaying the miscarriage searches. I organized the pages with indexed, color-coded tabs. I built the physical ledger of her destruction. Just as I slid the final page into a plastic sleeve, my phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. It was a text message from David. Genesis, the message read. Valerie has asked me to sign an irrevocable trust document at the gala. It transfers the estate equity to her name to protect the baby's future. The notary is arriving at the country club at 7. I need you to look at the paperwork before I sign it. The ticking clock just accelerated. She was not waiting for the fake miscarriage to secure the assets. She was executing the financial drain live at the party. I picked up the heavy black binder. The stage was set, and the deadline was drawn. I stared at the text message illuminating my phone screen. The words irrevocable trust glowed against the dark background of my office. I did not text him back. I pressed the phone icon and lifted the receiver to my ear. The line rang twice before he answered. Genesis David said. His voice was a hollow rasp. It sounded like a man who had not slept a full night in a month. I heard the faint, rhythmic ticking of a turn signal in the background. He was sitting in his truck. He often retreated to the leather cab of his Ford when the atmosphere inside the colonial house became too suffocating. "Tell me about the paperwork," I said. "Keep your voice low." He sighed, a heavy sound that crackled over the cellular connection. "Valerie claims the high-risk nature of this pregnancy is keeping her awake at night. She says she is terrified of what might happen if my heart fails or if an accident occurs on one of my job sites. She wants to ensure the baby is protected from probate courts and business liabilities. She had her attorney draft a living trust. It transfers the primary equity of my contracting firm and the deeds to our commercial properties into a protected entity." "Who is the listed trustee?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Valerie is the sole trustee," David replied. "She manages the disbursements until the child turns 25. My fingernails dug into the leather cover of the black binder resting on my desk. The audacity was breathtaking. An irrevocable trust in the state of Rhode Island is a financial vault. Once the grantor signs the documents and the notary stamps the pages, the assets are legally severed from the original owner. David would be effectively signing his life's work over to a woman who possessed no uterus. He would become an employee of his own company. If he later discovered the fraud and filed for divorce, untangling an irrevocable trust would take years of brutal, expensive litigation. Valerie would drain the accounts long before a judge could freeze them. "She wants to sign this at the gala," I stated, pacing the length of my office. "She wants it to be a grand gesture," David explained, "a public declaration of our commitment to the future." She hired a private notary to attend the country club event. He is scheduled to arrive right before we reveal the gender. She wants me to sign the documents in front of our friends and family. The deadline was no longer a vague concept. It was a specific hour on a specific Saturday. If David put his pen to that paper at 7 o'clock, the trap would snap shut on his neck. "David," I said, choosing my words with clinical precision, "do not sign that document." He fell silent. The ticking of his turn signal continued. "Genesis," he finally murmured, "you know how she gets. If I refuse to sign it, she will accuse me of abandoning our child. She will claim the stress is endangering her health. I cannot risk her blood pressure spiking. The Boston doctor said any severe emotional distress could induce premature labor. He was paralyzed by a fabricated medical hostage situation. He was a capable, intelligent businessman reduced to a terrified hostage because he believed he was protecting a fragile life. I could not simply tell him the baby was a ghost. If I dropped the truth over the phone while he sat alone in his truck, he would hang up. He would walk inside the house and confront her. Valerie would orchestrate a spectacular panic attack. She would dial 911, claim I was a jealous daughter trying to ruin her marriage, and David would be forced to choose between his weeping wife and a voice on the phone. I needed him to see the illusion shatter with his own eyes. I needed him to initiate the collapse. "Listen to me," I said, stopping my pacing and staring out the window into the dark Providence night. "You are about to hand over your entire estate. You have every right to ask for a guarantee. You have every right to bond with your child." "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I am suggesting you go to the local pharmacy tomorrow morning," I told him. "Walk down the family planning aisle. Buy a handheld fetal Doppler monitor. They cost $40. They run on standard batteries. They are designed for anxious parents to listen to the heartbeat at home." I let the instructions settle into his mind. "Bring the device to the gala," I continued. "Keep it in your jacket pocket. When the notary arrives, before you pick up the pen, ask her to use it. Tell her you want the entire room to hear the miracle. Tell her it will make the signing ceremony even more profound." "But Valerie says the gel is too messy," David countered, his voice trembling slightly. "She says the telehealth doctor advised against using commercial devices." I gripped the phone tighter. If this baby is real, she will not mind proving it. She is standing in front of 100 people who are writing checks to support her. She will not be able to refuse a simple, joyful request from her husband. Ask to hear the heartbeat, David. Just ask to hear the heartbeat. The line went entirely quiet. The ticking of the turn signal stopped. My stepfather was not a foolish man. He possessed sharp instincts that had kept his business afloat through 2 recessions. He had suppressed those instincts to accommodate my mother, but my instruction just reignited his internal alarm. I had planted a seed of doubt, and it was taking root in the fertile soil of his own unspoken suspicions.
"Okay," David whispered. His voice lacked the previous exhaustion. It was replaced by a rigid, terrifying clarity. "I will buy the monitor. I will bring it to the party. I will review the trust paperwork when I arrive," I promised him. "Just wait for my signal." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto my desk. The plan was in motion. David would trigger the climax. He would pull the pin on the grenade, and I would be standing there with the ledger to ensure Valerie could not escape the blast radius. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and opened the thick black binder. I traced my finger over the printed copy of the revoked medical license and the offshore clinic emails. Everything was organized. Every lie was cataloged. But my auditor brain snagged on a single, glaring discrepancy. It was the notary. The concept of a notary attending a lavish country club party on a Saturday evening to finalize an irrevocable trust was highly irregular. Trust attorneys and estate planners execute complex financial transfers in quiet, secure boardrooms during standard business hours. They require identity verification witnesses and legal counsel present. Valerie was bypassing the entire standard legal protocol. She had hired a private mobile notary to stamp a document that transferred a multi-million-dollar estate in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Why was she rushing the ink? Why was it so vital that the money transferred at that exact moment? I opened a new search window on my workstation. I needed to know who this notary was. I needed to know who was holding the stamp. The hunt shifted vectors. I was no longer looking for medical records. I was looking for the man who was coming to the party to steal my stepfather's wealth. The deadline was approaching, and I had a new target to audit. The glowing screens of my dual monitors cast a pale blue light across my home office. It was 2 a.m. Liam was asleep down the hall, and the rest of Providence was quiet, but my mind was running through a labyrinth of legal and financial anomalies. The concept of a mobile notary executing an irrevocable trust at a country club gala on a Saturday night continued to gnaw at my auditor instincts. In Rhode Island, a notary public is a state-commissioned official. Their registry is public record. I accessed the Secretary of State portal and waited. I needed a name. I picked up my phone and opened my text thread with David. "Who is the notary Valerie hired for Saturday?" I typed, hitting send, before I could second-guess the late hour. To my surprise, the red receipt illuminated immediately. David was awake. 3 gray dots danced on the screen. A man named Silas Vance David replied. Valerie said he is a private contractor her attorney recommended. He handles expedited estate transfers. Silas Vance. I copied the name and pasted it into the Secretary of State notary database. The search returned 0 results. I tried variations of the spelling. I expanded the search to include Massachusetts and Connecticut registries. There was no commissioned notary public licensed to operate in New England under that name. The man coming to the country club was a phantom. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. If Silas Vance was not a notary, the irrevocable trust document David was supposed to sign was not a legally binding estate transfer. It was a prop. But Valerie was not a woman who orchestrated complex theater without a tangible financial payout. She needed David to sign that specific document at that exact moment for a reason. I shifted my focus away from notary registries and opened my subscription to the Federal Civil Docket Network. I ran a broad search using Valerie's legal name, bypassing the medical subrogation records I had found earlier. I narrowed the parameters to financial judgments, liens, and quiet claims
filed within the last 12 months. The database crawled. I listened to the faint hum of my workstation fan. Then a single, devastating document populated my screen. It was a civil lien filed quietly in a neighboring county court just 6 weeks ago. The claimant was a limited liability corporation registered as Vance Holdings. The defendant was my mother. The document detailed a staggering financial deficit. Valerie owed a principal sum of $65,000 to Vance Holdings. The debt originated from a series of high-interest, short-term personal loans secured against collateral she did not actually own. I stared at the screen, parsing the legal jargon. Vance Holdings was not a bank. It was not a traditional lending institution. A quick cross-reference of the LLC's incorporation documents revealed a bare-bones operation run out of a strip mall in Warwick. The registered agent was Silas Vance. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Silas Vance was a private creditor. He operated in the gray area of high-stakes personal lending, the kind of lending that often occurs near the luxury casinos operating just across the Connecticut border, the same casinos Valerie frequented when she claimed she was attending weekend wellness retreats. My mother had a catastrophic gambling addiction. She had borrowed $65,000 from a man who did not send polite collection letters. He filed a quiet lien to establish a legal claim, but men like Silas Vance do not wait for the slow grind of the court system to recover their capital. They demand immediate liquidity. The entire gala was a heist. The irrevocable trust document was not an estate transfer. It was a direct, localized, wire transfer authorization disguised under a cover sheet of legal estate jargon. Valerie planned to have David sign the document in the middle of a crowded ballroom. She would present Silas Vance as the official notary. Silas would take the signed authorization, stamp it with a fake seal to maintain the illusion for the guests, and leave the party with a direct conduit to David's primary business accounts. Silas would get his $65,000, effectively clearing Valerie's gambling debt before her kneecaps were broken. The stakes were no longer confined to emotional manipulation or standard wire fraud. My mother was introducing a predatory creditor into a room full of unsuspecting family members. She was utilizing my stepfather's trusting nature to execute a high-risk debt settlement in plain sight. The audacity was sickening, but the desperation was palpable. Valerie was a cornered animal. The crowdfunding campaign money was locked in a holding account. The fake pregnancy was a ticking biological clock. Silas Vance was closing in. She had designed the country club gala as her grand escape hatch. I pushed my chair back from the monitors. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of absolute comprehension. The ledger was finally complete. I understood the motive, the method, and the timeline. I reached for the thick black binder resting on the corner of my desk. I opened the rings and inserted the printed copy of the civil lien. I added the LLC incorporation documents listing Silas Vance. I arranged the pages chronologically. Tab 1 contained the medical subrogation claim detailing her hysterectomy. Tab 2 contained the revoked medical license of the disgraced Boston physician. Tab 3 contained the reverse image search of the glossy stock photo ultrasound. Tab 4 contained the offshore adoption agency inquiry. Tab 5 contained the GoFundMe routing data. Tab 6 contained the $65,000 gambling lien held by the fake notary. This was the ledger of truth. It was heavy, meticulously cited, and lethal. I closed the binder. The leather cover felt cold under my palms. I had spent 13 years running from the financial wreckage my mother created when I was a teenager. I had built a career designed to protect data and expose anomalies. Now all of my training, all of my discipline, and all of my quiet observation had culminated in this single volume. I looked at the clock on the bottom corner of my screen. It was almost 3 a.m. The gender reveal gala was scheduled for Saturday evening. I had 48 hours to prepare for the most brutal audit presentation of my life. I turned off the desk lamp. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I did not feel dread. I felt a profound, dangerous calm. The target was acquired. The trap was set. All I had to do was walk into the ballroom, take my seat, and wait for my stepfather to ask for a heartbeat.
Saturday evening arrived with a biting chill that swept off the Narragansett Bay. Liam navigated our SUV through the wrought iron gates of the Providence Country Club. The tires crunched over fallen oak leaves as we pulled up to the grand portico. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open car doors, welcoming a steady stream of local elite. I did not wear a pastel dress. I did not wear floral prints. I chose a tailored charcoal black suit with sharp lapels and a silk blouse. It felt like armor. My low-heeled leather boots clicked against the cobblestone walkway with a steady, metronomic rhythm. Liam walked close beside me. His right hand rested on the small of my back, while his left arm cradled the thick black leather binder against his ribs. The ledger held the weight of a loaded weapon. We stepped through the double oak doors and handed our coats to the attendant. The grand ballroom lay just ahead, accessible through a set of open French doors. Mallory had spared zero expense. The soaring ceiling was draped in sweeping panels of pink and baby blue chiffon, illuminated by strategically placed uplighting. A towering arch, constructed of hundreds of iridescent balloons, framed a central stage. A string quartet occupied a far corner, playing a subdued classical rendition of a popular pop song. Waitstaff in white gloves circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of seared scallops and caviar blinis. 100 guests populated the polished hardwood floor. It was a curated roster of Rhode Island upper-middle-class society. I recognized local politicians, prominent real estate developers, and the affluent members of David's Golf Syndicate. They clinked crystal glasses and laughed, oblivious to the fact that they were attending a high-stakes heist. My eyes scanned the crowd, instantly locating the architect of the illusion. Valerie stood near the edge of the stage holding court. She wore a custom blush-colored gown crafted from draped silk. The fabric gathered tightly just above the pronounced, undeniable curve of her midsection. She rested her hands on the peak of the silicone prosthetic, projecting an aura of fragile, radiant maternity. As I watched, a wealthy supplier from David's contracting firm approached her. The man offered a warm handshake and produced a thick, embossed white envelope. Valerie smiled, her eyes crinkling with practiced gratitude. She accepted the offering and turned toward a draped table sitting adjacent to the stage. Resting on the linen cloth was a large, clear acrylic box. The slot at the top was wide. The interior was already stuffed with personal checks envelopes of cash and premium gift cards. She slipped the supplier's envelope through the slot. It joined the harvest. I shifted my gaze away from the acrylic box and began a systematic sweep of the perimeter. A skilled auditor does not focus on the loudest anomaly. The loudest anomaly is designed to distract. You look for the quiet discrepancy. You look for the data point that does not fit the established pattern. I found him near the emergency exit doors. The man sat alone at a high-top cocktail table. He did not blend in with the curated elegance of the country club. The other male guests wore bespoke tailoring, subdued neckties, and expensive watches. This man wore a shiny, inexpensive navy blazer that pulled tight across his broad shoulders. His collar was unbuttoned, and his tie hung crookedly against a striped shirt. He possessed a restless, kinetic energy, bouncing his right knee rapidly against the metal leg of the high-top table. He nursed a glass of scotch, swirling the amber liquid over a single cube of ice. Resting on the floor between his scuffed leather boots was a battered, hard-shell briefcase. He was not a country club member. He was not a distant relative. He watched Valerie with the unblinking, predatory focus of a loan shark waiting to collect a debt. Silas Vance had arrived. The fake notary was on the clock. I looked toward the mahogany bar situated on the opposite side of the room. David stood isolated from the celebratory clusters of guests. He held a glass of club soda with both hands. His posture was rigid, his shoulders drawn up near his ears. He checked his wristwatch, his face drawn and pale under the ambient lighting. I caught his eye across the sea of tailored suits and silk dresses. I offered a single, microscopic nod. David swallowed hard. He reached up and patted the left breast pocket of his jacket. The fabric bulged slightly. The fetal Doppler monitor was secured in place. He had followed my instructions. The trigger mechanism was primed. Valerie's gaze flicked across the room and landed on me. Her radiant smile remained frozen in place, but her eyes hardened into twin points of dark flint. She excused herself from a circle of admiring wives and glided across the polished floor. The heavy, sweet scent of gardenia perfume announced her arrival before she spoke. She stepped into my personal space, invading the standard boundary of polite conversation. She reached out, grasping my upper arm. To any casual observer, it looked like a mother sharing a tender private moment with her adult daughter. The reality was a vice grip. Her manicured fingernails dug sharply through the wool sleeve of my suit. "I am so glad you decided to show up, Genesis," she whispered. Her voice was a low, venomous hiss, masked by the broad smile plastered across her face. "I was worried your petty jealousy would keep you at home." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. "You have quite the audience tonight," I replied, my tone flat and conversational. Valerie leaned an inch closer. The silicone mound pressed lightly against my jacket. "Do not ruin my night," she warned. "I know you hate seeing me happy. I know you resent the life David provides for me. But if you cause a scene, if you utter one disrespectful word, I will ensure David cuts you out of the family entirely. You will not see a dime of the estate." She was playing her final card, assuming my silence was governed by the same financial greed that fueled her own existence. She thought she could buy my compliance with the threat of disinheritance. She had no idea the estate she was threatening me with was currently targeted for immediate liquidation by the man sitting near the emergency exit. I met her hardened gaze. I looked into the eyes of the woman who had stolen my teenage credit, who had lied about her anatomy, and who was attempting to steal my stepfather's legacy. I felt no anger. The time for emotional turbulence had passed. "Enjoy the party, Valerie," I said, my voice chilled to near freezing. I stepped backward, breaking her grip on my arm. Valerie smoothed the front of her gown, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second as she tried to read my icy demeanor. She turned on her heel and glided back toward the acrylic money box, eager to resume her performance. Liam and I walked toward the front of the stage. 2 rows of padded chairs were arranged in a semicircle, reserved for immediate family. Aunt Helen was already seated in the front row. She wore a slate gray dress, sitting with perfect posture, sipping black coffee from a porcelain cup. Helen did not look at me as I took the seat beside her. She kept her eyes fixed on the towering balloon arch. "The wolves are circling," Helen murmured quietly, her voice barely carrying over the string quartet. I glanced at the acrylic box, then toward the high-top table where Silas Vance was checking his phone. "Yes," I replied. "Let them eat." Liam sat on my left side. He placed the heavy black leather binder on his lap, resting his hands flat against the cover. The audience continued to laugh, drink, and deposit their envelopes. They knew the schedule of events. They knew a balloon would pop and shower them with pink or blue confetti. They anticipated a joyous celebration of life. But sitting in the front row, I knew every hidden trapdoor installed beneath the polished hardwood floor. The music faded into silence. A man holding a microphone stepped onto the stage, tapping the metal grill to capture the room's attention. The master of ceremonies was preparing to introduce the guests of honor. The final act was beginning, and the floor was about to fall out. The string quartet lowered their bows in unison. A polite hush rippled across the crowded ballroom as the master of ceremonies retreated to the edge of the stage. The soft, ambient uplighting shifted, focusing a bright, warm spotlight directly onto the center platform. Valerie glided up the 3 carpeted steps. She moved with an agonizing slowness, placing a hand on the small rail, ensuring every guest in the room recognized the physical toll her imaginary pregnancy demanded. David followed a pace behind. His movements lacked her practiced grace. He walked like a man marching toward an execution, his shoulders rigid and his face drawn tight. Valerie reached the microphone stand. She adjusted the height, leaning close to the metallic grill. She let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds.
The audience hung on the delay, captive to her manufactured gravity. "Thank you," Valerie began, her voice trembling with the precise amount of emotional fragility. "Thank you from the very bottom of my exhausted heart for being here tonight."
She placed both hands over the pronounced curve of her blush silk gown. The silicone prosthetic sat seamlessly beneath the fabric. "They call advanced maternal age pregnancies geriatric," she said, offering a soft, self-deprecating chuckle that elicited sympathetic murmurs from the front rows. "But I prefer the term the Boston specialists use. They call it a miracle. And miracles, as David and I have learned over these past grueling months, require profound sacrifice." I sat in the front row next to Aunt Helen. My posture remained perfectly still. I watched the performance unfold with the detached focus of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent expense report. Valerie was weaving a masterpiece of emotional extortion. "There have been terrifying nights," Valerie continued, a single tear escaping the corner of her eye. "Nights where the monitor alarms blared and the telehealth doctors ordered strict bed rest. Nights where the financial burden of out-of-pocket experimental treatments threatened to break our resolve. But we fought. We fought for this fragile heartbeat." She turned her gaze toward my stepfather. David stood frozen under the spotlight. He was staring at the floorboards, refusing to meet her eyes. "And the man who led that fight is standing right here," Valerie said, reaching out to grasp David's rigid hand. "My husband has carried this family. He has sacrificed his time, his energy, and his resources to ensure this baby reaches full term safely. And because the future remains so unpredictable, because the high-risk nature of my condition leaves us vulnerable, David has made a decision that showcases the true depth of his devotion." Valerie turned back to the crowd. Her voice grew stronger, shedding the fragile tremor for an authoritative, commanding pitch. "Before we pop the balloon," she announced, pointing toward the massive arch of pink and blue latex hovering above them, "David is going to sign a document ensuring our child's future is permanently secured. An irrevocable living trust establishing a protected foundation for the life we created together." A low murmur of impressed approval spread through the country club guests. In their eyes, David was executing a profound act of paternal responsibility. Valerie gestured toward the emergency exit doors. "We have asked a private notary to join us this evening to make this commitment official, right here in front of the people who supported us through the darkest hours. Silas, if you would please step forward." Silas Vance stood up from his high-top table. He smoothed the lapels of his cheap navy blazer and picked up his battered hard-shell briefcase. He walked down the center aisle, moving with the heavy, blunt force of a man accustomed to collecting debts in parking lots rather than grand ballrooms. He climbed the stage stairs and placed the briefcase on a small wooden podium next to the microphone. He snapped the metal latches open. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy, brass-handled notary stamp. Silas pulled a sleek, expensive-looking fountain pen from his breast pocket and held it out toward David. David did not take the pen. The ballroom remained silent, waiting for the final stroke of ink that would authorize the transfer of a multi-million-dollar estate into the hands of a casino creditor. Silas extended the pen an inch closer. Valerie smiled, giving David's arm an encouraging squeeze. David pulled his hand away from her grip. He took a half step backward, distancing himself from the podium and the waiting paperwork. His chest rose and fell in a sharp, ragged breath. He looked at Silas, then looked at the fraudulent documents, and finally lifted his gaze to meet Valerie's expectant eyes. "Before I sign anything," David said. His voice was not amplified by the microphone, but the acoustics of the ballroom carried his words clearly across the silent crowd. The tremor in his voice was not manufactured. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a precipice, preparing to jump. Valerie's smile twitched. "David, sweetheart," she whispered, leaning closer to him. "The guests are waiting. Just sign the paperwork." David did not look at the guests. He maintained eye contact with his wife. "Before I sign away my company," he repeated his voice, gaining a sudden, desperate traction. "I want everyone to hear our miracle." He reached inside the left breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not pull out reading glasses.
He did not pull out a handkerchief. David pulled out a white plastic device. It featured a small digital screen, a speaker grill, and a curved wand-like attachment connected by a coiled wire. It was a standard commercial fetal Doppler monitor.
"I want to hear the heartbeat," David said, holding the device up so the spotlight caught the white plastic casing. "Right now, over the microphone." The silence in the room mutated. It was no longer a polite celebratory hush. It was the sharp, breathless quiet of a crowd realizing the script had violently deviated from the program. A woman in the third row let out a soft, confused gasp. Silas Vance lowered the fountain pen, his eyes darting between David and the exit doors. Valerie froze. The color drained from her face with such rapidity she looked like a marble statue. The blush silk gown suddenly looked less like a maternity dress and more like a costume she could not escape. "David," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy, "what are you doing?" "You told me the doctor ordered you to monitor the vitals daily," David replied. His tone was stripping away the protective layers of compliance he had worn for the past 8 weeks. "You told me the telehealth specialist required constant acoustic surveillance. Prove it. Let me bond with the baby." Valerie took a step backward, raising both hands as if to physically ward off the plastic device. The gel she choked out, grasping for an excuse. "The conductive gel is too messy. It will stain the silk." "This gown is custom, David. We cannot do this here." "I bought the kind that works through fabric," David countered, his voice rising, carrying a razor edge of absolute heartbreak. "Turn on the machine, Valerie." He took a step toward her. He thumbed the power dial on the side of the plastic casing. A sharp, loud click resonated from the device, followed by a low, humming wash of white noise. He held the wand attachment in his right hand. Valerie looked toward the audience. Her eyes were wide, frantic, seeking an escape route. She looked at the country club guests, then looked at Silas Vance, who was currently sliding the legal documents back into his briefcase. Finally, her gaze locked onto me, sitting in the front row. She knew. She saw the cold, unyielding reality etched across my face, and she knew the trap had closed. David stepped into her personal space. He did not ask for permission again. He pressed the curved wand of the fetal Doppler directly against the tight, blush-colored silk stretched across the peak of her stomach. The machine amplified the input. The speakers in the room did not broadcast the rapid, galloping rhythm of a fetal heartbeat. They did not broadcast the swoosh of amniotic fluid or the steady pulse of an umbilical cord. The ballroom speakers blasted a harsh, hollow scrape. It was the undeniable synthetic sound of plastic grinding against thick silicone rubber. A loud, abrasive crinkle echoed across the silent crowd, followed by dead, absolute static. The abrasive scrape of the plastic wand dragging across the synthetic belly echoed through the ballroom speakers. It was a harsh, grinding frequency. It sounded like thick rubber being stretched and compressed under heavy friction. David moved the white device 2 inches to the left. His hand was shaking. He pressed deeper into the blush silk fabric, searching for the rapid, fluttering thump of a fetal heart. He searched for the validation of the past 8 weeks, hoping the machine would prove his fears wrong. The machine broadcast only the hollow, dead static of an empty void. A collective intake of breath rippled through the front rows. A woman sitting near the center aisle covered her mouth with both hands. The silence that followed the static was heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of reality crashing through a carefully constructed theater. David stared at the digital readout on the small screen. The numbers remained at 0. He looked up at Valerie. His eyes begged her for a medical explanation, a technical excuse, any rational reason why the monitor could only detect the grinding of synthetic material. Valerie reacted with the feral instinct of a cornered predator. She smacked David's wrist, slapping the plastic wand away from her stomach. The sudden movement caused the speaker to emit a sharp, ear-splitting screech of feedback. "The device is broken," she shouted. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She took another step backward, clutching her hands over the silicone mound in a mock protective gesture. You bought cheap, defective garbage from a discount pharmacy, David. I told you the telehealth specialist warned us against this. The frequency waves are harmful. You are hurting the baby. It was a classic misdirection. I had witnessed this exact pivot a dozen times during my childhood. Whenever Valerie was caught in a lie, she immediately shifted the blame to the defective nature of the tools, the circumstances, or the sanity of the person holding her accountable. When she overdrafted our joint checking account years ago, she blamed a fictitious banking glitch. Now facing a ballroom of donors, she was attempting to gaslight her husband into believing he was endangering their child with a broken plastic toy. David looked at the device in his hand. He looked at the battery indicator. It glowed a bright, solid green. "The machine is functioning," David whispered. His voice was fragile, cracking under the weight of the undeniable truth. "There is nothing there, Valerie. There is no sound." She shook her head, tears spilling over her eyelashes. Her performance slipped from radiant martyr to hysterical victim. "You are having a nervous breakdown," she cried, gesturing toward the crowd. "The stress of the business is ruining your mind. Somebody take that machine away from him." Nobody moved. The country club guests remained glued to their seats, trapped in a paralysis of social shock. The men in bespoke suits and the women in evening gowns stared at the stage, watching the prestigious foundation of the evening crumble into a grotesque spectacle. Then the chair next to me squeaked against the polished hardwood floor. Aunt Helen stood up. She did not rush. She smoothed the front of her slate gray dress and took a single step out of the front row, positioning herself at the base of the carpeted stairs. She looked up at her younger sister. Helen possessed the cold, unyielding authority of a woman who had long ago stopped accepting family loyalty as a currency for deception. Valerie stopped crying. Her eyes locked onto Helen, and a flash of genuine terror crossed her face. "Valerie," Helen said. Her voice did not require a microphone. It cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom with surgical precision. "You have not possessed a uterus since 2014. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They did not register immediately with the crowd. It took a few seconds for the biological finality of the statement to sink into the minds of the audience. "What exactly is in there?" Helen asked, pointing a steady finger at the blush silk gown. If the static from the Doppler had cracked the illusion, Helen's question shattered the glass entirely. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The polite whispers mutated into an escalating wave of audible horror. The supplier, who had just deposited the thick, embossed envelope into the acrylic money box, stood up from his table, his face a mask of furious realization. The string quartet players exchanged bewildered glances, placing their instruments on the floor. David took 3 stumbling steps backward. He bumped into the wooden podium, knocking the microphone stand askew. The feedback whined again. He dropped the white plastic monitor. It hit the stage floor with a sharp crack, the batteries spilling out and rolling across the carpet. He stared at Valerie. He looked at the curve of her stomach, the shape he had caressed just hours ago, the shape he had built a nursery for. The realization broke him. The man who had poured foundations and framed houses could not process the structural collapse of his own life. "It is silicone." He breathed out the words, barely audible. "It is fake." Valerie's jaw dropped open. She looked from Helen to David to the sea of guests who were now standing, pointing and demanding answers. Her pristine, curated world was disintegrating in real time. The golden halo of maternal sympathy vanished, leaving behind the stark, ugly reality of a grifter caught under the stage lights. At the edge of the platform, the dynamic of the heist shifted. Silas Vance did not care about the biological revelation. He did not care about the broken heart of the contractor or the shock of the country club elite. He only cared about his $65,000 debt, and he instantly recognized that the primary asset transfer was dead. Silas reached out and grabbed the brass-handled notary stamp. He tossed it into his battered hardshell briefcase. He gathered the fraudulent, irrevocable trust documents, shoving them roughly inside the leather compartments. He snapped the metal latches shut.
The loud metallic clacks echoed over the rising din of the ballroom. He picked up the briefcase and turned his back on the stage. He moved with the swift, practiced efficiency of a man who knew how to exit a failing operation before the authorities arrived. He kept his head down, dodging past a table of stunned guests, making a direct line for the emergency exit doors located near the catering kitchen. The fake notary was fleeing the scene. Valerie was hyperventilating, clutching her synthetic stomach. David was leaning against the podium, gasping for air. The audience was descending into chaotic outrage. The social performance had collapsed, but the audit was not finished. The crowd knew it was a lie, but they did not yet know the depth of the theft. They did not know about the stock photo, the disgraced doctor, the gambling liens, or the offshore adoption emails. I stood up from my seat in the front row. I turned to Liam and held out my hand. He passed me the thick black leather binder. The weight of it settled into my palms, grounding me in the chaos. Silas Vance was trying to escape, and Valerie was trying to formulate her next lie. I walked toward the carpeted stairs. It was time to read the ledger. I walked up the carpeted stairs. The wood groaned under my leather boots. David was leaning heavily against the speaker stack, his breathing shallow. Valerie was backing away, her hands clutching her head. I ignored them both. I stepped to the wooden podium, righted the microphone stand David had knocked askew, and set the heavy black binder down. The thick leather cover struck the wood with a dull, authoritative thud. I leaned into the microphone. The man in the navy blazer currently pushing the crash bar on the emergency exit door is not a notary, I said. My voice was devoid of emotion. It was the same tone I used to present compliance failures to corporate boards. The acoustics carried the statement over the chaotic murmurs. 100 heads turned away from the stage and looked toward the back of the ballroom. Silas Vance froze. He had one hand on the red metal bar of the exit door. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing under the dim exit sign light. "His name is Silas Vance." I continued opening the binder and flipping to the first indexed tab. "He is a private creditor operating out of a strip mall in Warwick. He holds a $65,000 civil lien against my mother for unpaid gambling debts. The irrevocable trust document he just attempted to have my stepfather sign was not an estate transfer. It was a localized wire authorization, disguised under legal cover pages. My mother hired him to empty my stepfather's primary business accounts tonight, in front of all of you, to pay off her casino markers." A localized wave of shock rippled through the guests. The supplier, who had handed Valerie the thick envelope earlier, took a step forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Silas did not wait to defend himself. He shoved the crash bar pushed through the heavy metal door and disappeared into the crisp Rhode Island night, abandoning his client to the fallout. I let him go. The authorities could find him later. My focus was the woman on the stage. I turned the page in the binder. The rustle of heavy paper amplified through the mic. "For the past 8 weeks, you have been invited to participate in a high-risk medical journey," I said, looking out at the sea of tailored suits and evening gowns. "You have written checks, you have sent gifts, you have offered your sympathy. I am here to present the ledger of that journey." I flipped to the second tab. The sonogram my mother displayed at my baby shower, the same image printed on the invitations you received for this gala, is a stock photograph. It was downloaded from a maternal wellness blog based in Munich, Germany, originally published in November of 2019. She cropped the watermark and printed it on glossy office paper. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless sound, somewhere between a sob and a shriek. She lunged toward the podium, reaching for the microphone wire. "Shut up," she hissed. Her face contorted the blush silk gown, pulling awkwardly around the synthetic mound strapped to her waist. "Turn that off." I stepped in front of the stand, blocking her path. I did not raise a hand. I simply held my ground. She stopped, unwilling to initiate a physical altercation, under the bright, warm glare of the spotlight. I turned to the third tab. The telehealth specialist monitoring this high-risk condition is a man named Aris. He is a disgraced former physician. The Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine permanently revoked his license 3 years ago for operating a shadow clinic and executing severe prescription fraud. There are no medical bills because there is no medical care.
David let out a low, agonizing groan. He slid down the side of the speaker stack, his knees buckling, until he sat on the carpeted floor of the stage. He buried his face in his hands. The illusion he had staked his future on was being dismantled with clinical, irrefutable precision. I turned to the fourth tab. When the illusion began to require a physical conclusion, my mother realized a fake pregnancy eventually demands a baby. 3 weeks ago, she submitted an inquiry to an offshore, unregulated adoption agency operating out of Eastern Europe. She requested an expedited, undocumented placement of an infant. The agency demanded a $30,000 wire transfer to bypass international regulatory holding periods. The crowd recoiled. The financial grift was offensive, but the revelation of attempted child trafficking crossed a threshold that left the room stunned into a sickening silence. She abandoned that plan. I clarified, flipping to the fifth tab, revealing the printed search history. Not out of moral clarity, but due to logistical inconvenience. Her browser history confirms she pivoted to a new exit strategy. She researched methods to induce chemical miscarriages and stage late-term medical emergencies. Her final endgame was to fake a tragic loss later this month, ensuring she retained the sympathy of this community and the funds collected in her crowdfunding campaign, a campaign that constitutes federal wire fraud. I closed the binder. The audit was complete. Every lie, every manipulation, every calculated theft was laid bare under the ballroom lights. The silence in the country club was absolute. The guests looked at Valerie, no longer seeing a fragile, grieving mother. They saw a predator wrapped in silk. Valerie looked at the faces staring back at her. She saw the disgust. She saw the affluent society she worshipped turning their collective backs on her. The maternal martyr facade evaporated, leaving only the raw, frantic instinct of a cornered thief. She realized the social capital was gone. The only capital left was physical. She spun away from the podium and lunged toward the draped table sitting adjacent to the stage. Her manicured hands scrambled over the linen cloth, knocking over a vase of white hydrangeas. The water spilled across the fabric, soaking into the blush silk of her gown. She did not care. She grabbed the large, clear acrylic box. The box was heavy, stuffed with the personal checks, cash envelopes, and premium gift cards collected over the past 2 hours. She hoisted it against her chest, the hard plastic pressing awkwardly against the silicone prosthetic strapped to her abdomen. The sheer physical comedy of a woman in an evening gown wearing a fake belly, attempting to flee with a transparent box of stolen cash, would have been absurd if the underlying betrayal were not so devastating. She bypassed the center aisle, opting for the side pathway leading toward the grand foyer and the valet stand. Her low heels slipped slightly on the polished hardwood, but she caught her balance, her eyes fixed on the double oak doors. She did not make it past the second row of tables. 2 men stepped out from the crowd blocking the carpeted pathway. They were David's younger brothers. Both men worked for the family contracting firm. They spent their days hauling lumber, pouring concrete, and managing construction crews. They wore rented suits that fit tight across their broad shoulders. They stood side by side, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and bone. They did not shout. They did not raise their fists. They simply folded their arms across their chests and stared down at the woman who had just shattered their brother's life. Valerie skidded to a halt. The acrylic box bumped against her chin. She looked left, then right. A group of country club board members stepped forward, sealing off the gap between the tables. The supplier, who had donated the thick envelope, moved to block the rear flank. The guests were no longer an audience. They were a barricade. "Move," Valerie demanded, her voice cracking, stripped of its usual theatrical polish. "Get out of my way." David's brothers did not blink. They did not shift a single inch. Mallory was trapped. The matriarch's grand illusion had disintegrated, leaving her stranded in the middle of a Rhode Island ballroom,
clutching a plastic box of fraudulent gains, surrounded by 100 witnesses who now knew exactly who she was. The exit was sealed. The social performance was dead. But as she stood there hyperventilating and looking for a way out, the digital chime of a cash register echoed from the floor of the stage, signaling the final financial twist. The sharp, digitized ring of a cash register cut through the heavy silence of the barricaded ballroom. Cha-ching! The sound emanated from the stage floor, directly where my stepfather sat slumped against the speaker stack. It was the same custom notification tone that had plagued the baby shower 8 weeks prior. But this time it was followed by a second chime, then a third. A rapid succession of metallic rings echoed from his jacket pocket. Valerie stood trapped between David's brothers and the country club board members. She clutched the acrylic box of cash envelopes to her chest. Upon hearing the familiar alert, her posture shifted. The frantic panic dissolved, replaced by a sudden, jagged burst of hysterical laughter. It was a high, thin sound that scraped against the acoustics of the room. She let go of the box with one hand and reached into her custom gown. She retrieved her own smartphone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim, ambient light. "You are too late, Genesis," she sneered, her voice trembling with desperate triumph. She waved the glowing screen toward the stage. "The audit does not matter if the ledger is already cleared. You think you are so smart with your binders and your documents, but I set the crowdfunding platform to execute a scheduled sweep at 7:30. The transfer just initiated. $22,000 is routing to my private trust right now." She took a defiant step forward, raising her chin. "And since I am listed as a joint owner on the primary business checking accounts, I authorized an external wire transfer from my phone the second your little presentation started. Silas might have run out the door, but the money is moving. I am leaving this room, and I am taking everything." She looked at David, who was slowly pulling himself up from the carpeted floor, using the wooden podium for support. "I am leaving you, David," she stated, her words dripping with absolute malice. "You were always too weak to handle a real woman anyway." The cruelty was designed to land a final devastating blow. She wanted to walk out of the ballroom not as a defeated grifter, but as a financial conqueror who had outmaneuvered the auditor and broken the contractor. She believed she had won the digital race. David stood upright. He did not look weak. He looked like a man who had just survived a massive structural collapse and realized the foundation was still intact. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. The screen was illuminated with a cascade of push notifications. He looked at Valerie. He did not yell. He spoke with the quiet, weary authority of a man inspecting a failed inspection report. "That was not the sound of a wire transfer executing," David said, holding the screen up so the warm spotlight caught the display. "That was the sound of my accounts locking." Valerie's hysterical laughter sputtered and died, her arm lowered slowly, the glowing screen of her own device dipping toward the floor. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice losing its venomous edge. "I called Genesis late last night." David explained, his gaze steady. "She warned me about the notary. She explained the vulnerabilities in the joint accounts. This morning, before the bank opened, I met with my corporate attorney and the branch manager. We executed a total asset freeze. I moved the primary liquidity of the contracting firm and the commercial property deeds into an isolated, protected corporate entity that requires dual biometric authorization to access." He tapped the screen of his phone. "Those notifications," he continued, "the ones making that chime are automated fraud alerts. The bank just flagged an unauthorized wire attempt from your mobile device. They instantly blocked the transaction. The joint accounts you tried to drain are currently holding exactly $0. Valerie stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the bay. The color drained from her face again, leaving a stark, grayish pallor behind her heavy makeup. And the crowdfunding platform David added his voice, dropping another octave. "When Genesis uncovered the campaign, she noticed you set it up using the wireless network at our house in East Greenwich. That means the IP address is registered to my primary residential account. I called the fraud department of the platform this afternoon. I informed them that a campaign hosted on my network was operating under false medical pretenses. I provided them with a sworn affidavit. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. They froze the Miracle Fund at 5 o'clock this evening, David stated. The capital is locked in a federal compliance review. They are initiating a full wire fraud investigation. You are not receiving a single cent of that $22,000. The platform will be returning the funds to the donors by next week. The poetic justice landed with the crushing weight of a falling anvil. Valerie had designed an intricate, multi-layered financial heist. She had weaponized emotional sympathy, manipulated legal documents, and leveraged the social capital of a country club gala. But she had underestimated the quiet, methodical defense of an auditor and the decisive action of a wounded man. She had triggered the wire transfers, believing she was securing her escape route. Instead, she had actively tripped the very fraud alerts designed to cage her. By attempting to execute the theft, she had provided the bank with the digital footprint required to freeze her access permanently. She was left standing in the middle of the ballroom, holding a plastic box. And Silas Vance, the casino creditor holding a $65,000 lien against her, was still out there in the crisp Rhode Island night. He did not get his money. He had fled the scene empty-handed, and men like Silas do not forgive unpaid debts simply because a gala presentation goes poorly. Valerie was completely isolated. She had zero liquidity, a pending federal wire fraud investigation, and a predatory lender waiting in the shadows. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor. The acrylic box shattered against the ground. The plastic cracked down the center, spilling personal checks, cash envelopes, and premium gift cards across the polished boards. She did not weep. She did not scream. She sat in the wreckage of her grand illusion, surrounded by the scattered currency she could no longer claim, staring blankly at the pink and blue balloons hovering above the stage. The guests did not move to assist her. The board members did not offer a hand. They simply watched the matriarch of the evening sit in the ruins of her own making. I looked at David. He offered a single, exhausted nod of gratitude. He would survive this. He would file for divorce on Monday morning. He would heal. I closed the thick black leather binder. The audit was over. The ledger was balanced. There was nothing left to document in this room. I stepped down the carpeted stairs and walked toward the front row. Aunt Helen had already stood up, smoothing her slate gray dress. She gave me a brief, approving glance before turning toward the coat check. Liam was waiting for me. He reached out, taking the heavy binder from my hands. He tucked it securely under his arm, freeing my hands. I slipped my fingers through his. His grip was warm, steady, and solidly grounded in reality. We turned our backs on the stage, the shattered acrylic box, and the silent crowd of Rhode Island society. We walked down the center aisle, our footsteps synchronized. We passed the tables of uneaten caviar blinis and the abandoned string quartet instruments. We walked through the double oak doors and out into the crisp, biting air of the portico. We did not look back. The noise of my mother's drama was entirely contained within the brick walls of the country club. Outside, the night was quiet, cold, and perfectly clear. The air smelled of salt and imminent snow. My phone vibrated in my pocket as Liam handed the valet our ticket. It was an email notification from my obstetrician, confirming my final prenatal appointment. The reality of my own impending motherhood pressed against me. The contrast was absolute. Behind me lay a theater built on lies and stolen funds. Ahead of me lay a genuine, quiet life, requiring no audience. The car arrived. Liam opened the passenger door. I stepped inside the heat of the SUV washing over me, ready to return to the sage green nursery waiting in Providence, where the only heartbeat that mattered was authentic, verifiable, and entirely mine. 2 months later, the first heavy snow of the season blanketed Providence. The winter storm buried the city under a thick layer of quiet white, muting the traffic on the interstate and turning the bare oak trees into frosted silhouettes. I sat in a private recovery suite at the Women and Infants Hospital. The room smelled of clean cotton, sterile antiseptic, and the faint, sweet scent of newborn skin. Outside the double-paned glass, the snow fell in a steady, mesmerizing rhythm. Inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic beeping of the telemetry monitors mounted to the wall. These were real medical instruments. They tracked genuine vital signs. They registered the steady, thumping cadence of a healthy human heart. There was no static. There was no synthetic friction. There was only the undeniable biological proof of life. Liam sat in a vinyl armchair near the window. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locked onto the small bundle wrapped in a striped hospital blanket, cradled in his arms. Our daughter was 3 hours old. She possessed a shock of dark hair and small, perfect fingers that curled into tight fists. Liam watched her breathe with a level of awe that required no audience, no microphone, and no tailored silk. His devotion was entirely authentic. The heavy wooden door to the recovery suite clicked open. David stepped into the room. He wore a heavy wool sweater and a faded canvas jacket dusted with fresh snow. He carried a cardboard tray holding 3 cups of black coffee and a small, plush green dinosaur. The transformation in my stepfather over the past 8 weeks was staggering. At the country club gala, he had resembled a hostage, pale, exhausted, and suffocating under the weight of a fabricated medical crisis. Walking into the hospital room today, he looked 10 years younger. The rigid tension in his jaw had dissolved. His shoulders were relaxed. He moved with the grounded, capable energy of a man who had reclaimed his own foundation. He set the coffee tray on the rolling tray table and handed the plush dinosaur to Liam. "The roads are icing over," David whispered, keeping his voice low to avoid startling the baby. "But I was not going to miss this." He stepped to the side of my hospital bed. He did not offer grand theatrical speeches. He simply leaned down and kissed my forehead. His eyes were bright and clear. David was no longer my mother's husband. The divorce had been swift, brutal, and remarkably efficient. Because Valerie had attempted to execute a fraudulent wire transfer against his business accounts, David's corporate attorneys possessed all the leverage required to bypass standard mediation. They filed emergency injunctions severing her access to the estate entirely. The colonial house in East Greenwich was listed for sale. David had rented a quiet, comfortable apartment near the harbor, prioritizing peace over square footage. He was no longer bound to Valerie by marriage, but he was bound to us by choice. He had stood in the wreckage of a ballroom, realized the depth of the deception, and chose to remain a father to the daughter who handed him the ledger. Aunt Helen sat on the small sofa on the opposite side of the room. She held a cup of coffee blowing softly across the rim. She wore a tailored wool coat and her practical leather loafers. "She is a beautiful girl," Genesis Helen said, looking toward Liam and the baby. "She has your focus. She is already observing the room." Helen had remained a constant, silent sentinel since the night of the gala. She represented the end of a generational cycle. For decades, the women in our family had tolerated Valerie's extortion, assuming silence was the price of maintaining peace. Helen had been the first to walk away 10 years ago. I was the second. Looking at my newborn daughter, I knew with absolute certainty she would never have to learn the defense mechanisms I had perfected. The cycle stopped here. The reality of my mother's current existence stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the hospital suite. Valerie's grand illusion had not just collapsed socially, it had triggered a severe, unyielding legal avalanche. The crowdfunding platform had finalized their internal compliance review a week after the country club incident. When their investigators verified the IP addresses and cross-referenced the revoked medical license of the Boston physician, they did not just refund the donors. They handed the entire digital file over to federal authorities. Valerie was currently facing an open indictment for federal wire fraud. The authorities do not care about emotional theatrics or tears shed in a driveway. They only care about interstate commerce violations and documented digital theft. Furthermore, the local fallout had been clinical and merciless. When Silas Vance fled the country club, he realized his quiet lien was now public knowledge. He could no longer rely on intimidation. He sold the debt to a third-party collection agency that specialized in aggressive, relentless asset recovery. Valerie was stripped of her credit, her country club membership, and her social standing. The Rhode Island Gaming Commission had placed her on the permanent exclusion list. She was legally barred from setting foot inside any casino or card room in New England. The velvet ropes she used to glide past were now iron gates locked against her. She was living in a cheap, short-term rental complex across the state line. There were no customized replica cribs. There were no designer maternity gowns. She was entirely isolated, waiting for a federal summons, stripped of the audience she required to survive. Liam stood up from the armchair. He walked over to the bed and carefully transferred our daughter into my arms. The weight of her settled against my chest. It was a solid, grounding pressure. I brushed my thumb across her soft cheek. She shifted in her sleep, exhaling a tiny, warm breath. I looked at David sipping his coffee. I looked at Aunt Helen watching the snow fall against the glass. I looked at Liam standing steadfast by my side. I had built a fortress of truth, and it had held against the storm. Throughout my career, people have often viewed the role of an auditor as destructive. They assume we walk into thriving environments and tear them apart, hunting for flaws, eager to ruin reputations. They view the ledger as a weapon. But sitting in that quiet hospital room, holding the undeniable proof of life in my arms, the philosophy of my profession crystallized into a fundamental life lesson. An audit does not destroy a company. It simply reveals what was already bankrupt. The ledger does not create the deficit. The ledger reflects the choices made by the management. I did not ruin my mother's life at the country club. I did not manufacture her gambling debts, her revoked doctors, or her silicone props. I just stopped hiding the math. I just stopped balancing her ledger with my own sanity. When you refuse to subsidize a predator's illusion, the collapse is their own doing. You are merely the accountant handing them the final receipt. That is my story, the tale of a fake sonogram, a digital cash register chime, and a black leather binder that cleared the board. If someone in your life is demanding you fund their illusions with your peace, if they are extorting your joy to maintain their own hollow facades, let this be your notice. Stop paying the bill. Hand them the ledger. The truth is the best boundary you will ever set. Thank you for listening to Pan of Vengeance. If you have ever had to execute a personal audit on a toxic relative, drop a comment below and share how you finally cut the funding. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.